Hello everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. Version 2.4 and Lantern Rite are right around the corner, meaning that Xiao, Chunhe, Ganyu, and Zhongli are all about to be up for grabs. In my last few videos we discussed Xiao and Chunhe and whether or not they're worth it. We went into full detail about what we know about their kits, and how they do or will likely stand in today's current meta. If you're interested in either of these two, make sure to go back and watch those videos. However, today the focus isn't on Xiao or Chunhe, but instead a character that everyone has their eyes on. The only, the Coco Goat, Ganyu. And although she's still a little ways off considering that she is going to be on the second half of 2.4, I still think that now is a great time to discuss whether or not Ganyu is still worth it. It's common knowledge that Ganyu has been hailed as one of the overall best characters in Genshin Impact, being touted as one of the best, if not the best DPS in the game. However, many players are still wondering whether or not this is true till today. Is Ganyu really as good as people say she is, or is she just wildly overhyped? So today we're going to be breaking down Ganyu's kit, as well as analyzing possible weapon choices, her best artifacts, her best teammates, and even whether or not her constellations are worth it, in order to get a better understanding of where Ganyu fits in today's current meta, and to help you make a better decision on whether or not you want to summon for Ganyu, based on your gameplay preferences and what you might need for your account. If you do end up finding the video helpful at all, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. I'd greatly appreciate it, and it does help me boost into the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. We're currently getting very close to 20,000 subscribers, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Okay, but with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. Ah yes, the beloved Coco Goat. You may not believe this considering just how popular Ganyu is now. However, prior to her release, a lot of people actually thought that Ganyu was not going to be worth summoning for. People took a look at her kit, saw what she could do, and instantly thought that she was only going to be a dedicated support unit. And to be fair, this makes complete sense when you look at her kit. Most of Ganyu's kit revolves around cryo application and taunting her enemies. We knew that she had a special charge attack, however many people chalked this up to dealing a lot of AoE cryo application and that it wouldn't actually be substantial damage. Oh, how wrong everyone was. Because when Ganyu did finally release, her damage multipliers were absolutely insane. The unit everyone thought was going to be a designated support unit ended up being a very capable main DPS. Actually, that's a huge understatement. At the time of her release, the only DPS 5 stars that we had in the game were Diluc, Keqing, and Tartaglia. And if I'm being completely honest, Ganyu completely curb stomped all of them, and it all boiled down to her kit and her damage multipliers. Let's start with Ganyu's bread and butter, her normal and charged attacks. Or correction, just her charged attacks. When you're playing with Ganyu, you hardly ever want to be using your auto attacks except for in very specific situations, such as if you're running her on a freeze team with Xingqiu. Otherwise, 99.9% of the time you're going to want to be charging up her charged attack. This is because if you do reach charge level 2, you can fire off Frostflake arrows. Not only will you hit the enemy with your initial charge attack, but you will get a second instance of damage called Bloom damage that not only hits harder than the initial charge attack, but also spreads out and hits in an AoE. This means that you can hit enemy weak points, apply cryo, and hit multiple enemies all with one attack. And on top of all this, when you unlock her first passive, now after firing a Frostflake arrow, the crit rate of subsequent Frostflake arrows and the resulting bloom effects is increased by 20% for 5 seconds. This is a free 20% crit rate boost to your Frostflake arrows, which is absolutely massive to her total damage output. And as I mentioned, this charge attack has extremely high damage scaling. A C0 free-to-play Ganyu can easily expect between 20 to 30,000 damage on a bloom, so long as she's properly invested. Meanwhile, a Ganyu with her best in slot, the Amos bow, as well as her Constellation 1 can easily hit between 30 to 50,000 damage. And keep in mind that this is actually without factoring any elemental reactions. When you start adding things like melt into the mix, you're essentially timesing her damage by 1.5, and therefore it's extremely easy to hit bloom damage for over 60,000 damage. It's also very important to note that you can actually melt both her initial charged attack damage and her bloom damage, which can lead to crazy high amounts of damage in a very short period of time. This doesn't even factor in things like a Nemo Shred, Kazuha's elemental damage buff, Bennett's buff and pyro application, because when you start to factor in all of these possible options, Ganyu becomes a complete monster. But even with melt aside, there is one thing that I want you to focus on, and if it's the one thing that you take away from this video, I want it to be that Ganyu's charge attack is special. Unlike most main DPS characters, she's not reliant on her skill or her burst burst in order to deal substantial damage. Yes, obviously her skill and her burst do add to her overall damage, but it is not her main source of damage. This means that Ganyu has next to no cooldowns and can consistently be dealing damage at all times. Hu Tao, Yoimiya, and Child all rely on their skill, and Xiao, Eula, and Ayaka all rely on their burst, meaning that if you're not paying proper attention to your rotations as well as your energy, then you're gonna lose out on damage when using these other units. This means that as long as you're consistently able to charge up Ganyu's charge attack, then you're golden. This, in my opinion, is Ganyu's absolute biggest strength and the key to using her as a main damage dealer. However, while this does make Ganyu an exceptional unit, it also makes her a lot harder to use than some other characters. Unlike other characters where you can just kind of attack and you'll snap to the enemy, in order to maximize your damage with Ganyu, you actually have to aim and shoot and hit the enemy. And whenever you whiff, this is a huge loss in DPS. Luckily, if you mess up, you can just charge up another Frostflake arrow, but if you're not really good at that aim and shoot gameplay style, then you're not going to benefit as much from having Ganyu on your account as someone who is, meaning that mobile and console users usually end up having a little bit of a harder time using Ganyu compared to PC users. This isn't a deal breaker considering her charge attacks do have a big AoE, but it's definitely something to consider for min-maxers. However, while her charge attacks are the heart of her kit, they're definitely not the only thing that Ganyu has going for her. Ganyu also has access to her elemental skill that lays down a Cryo Lotus. This Lotus deals damage upon hitting enemies, while simultaneously producing energy particles. On top of this, her elemental skill does taunt enemies when they're nearby, and allows Ganyu to dash back and get out of harm's way. While this skill might be a lower priority compared to her charge attack and her burst, it's still an integral part of Ganyu's kit. When dealing with a lot of small enemies, this taunt is extremely valuable, because it allows you to dodge out of the way of incoming attacks, allows you to reposition yourself, and allows you to attack your enemies without them attacking you. Also, the damage that you can get from her skill exploding is actually hardly negligible. Although it's definitely not as impressive as her Frostflake arrows, it definitely does add to her total damage output. It also helps you take advantage of elemental reactions like freeze and melt while off field, and can help support your other units if you're not using Ganyu as your main DPS. Another important thing to mention is that her skill actually gives you energy twice. Once when you first deploy the Cryo Lotus and it hits an enemy, and then again when the Cryo Lotus blooms, meaning that it's actually pretty important to hit the enemies both times with the Cryo Lotus in order to make sure that you're getting your energy back. Okay, but what about her burst? While it might not be as powerful as a Hu Tao nuke or a Eula nuke, I do think that Ganyu's burst is wildly underestimated. Not only does it have an insane radius, but it lasts a whopping 15 seconds. On top of this, the burst cooldown is only 15 seconds, meaning that as long as you have proper energy recharge, you can actually have her burst up at all times. And its energy cost is only 60, meaning that it's actually pretty spammable, meaning that not only will she be dealing damage while on field and off field, but she's consistently able to apply cryo to her enemies, making her an extremely valuable member of a freeze comp or a melt comp. And if this wasn't enough, once you unlock her second passive, Harmony Between Heaven and Earth, Ganyu's Celestial Shower now provides an additional 20% cryo bonus damage to all members within its AoE, meaning that not only is Ganyu able to increase her own cryo damage, but all party members' cryo damage. And I have to bring this to your attention again just to make sure that everyone's getting the message, but this can be up 100% of the time. And while yes, you might not want to always be using it on a reverse melt comp because it could mess up your melts, but in a freeze team, this is absolutely one of the best bursts in the game. Okay, but now that we've gone over her kit, what about her weapons? Is Ganyu free-to-play friendly in terms of weapons, or do you need to rely on 5-star options? Luckily, Ganyu is actually pretty free-to-play friendly, and surprisingly, all of her best 4-star damage-dealing bows are all free-to-play accessible. First off, you have the Prototype Crescent, which can give you an absolutely massive attack boost of 36% if you manage to hit an enemy in its weak point. While free to play, this weapon actually hits surprisingly hard, and if you're a sharpshooter, you might end up enjoying this weapon a lot. However, I also think that it's pretty important to mention that this weapon passive cannot be used against bosses since they don't have weak points, and therefore you'll only be enjoying the passive when fighting hordes of smaller enemies. Also, if you do have a lot of star glitter saved up, then you could also go for the Blackcliff Warbow, the main selling point being that it does give you a lot of crit damage from its substat, and even more importantly, it matches her horns. But in all seriousness, this is actually a very good weapon on her, since it does help you balance out your crit stats, and if you manage to defeat enemies, then you actually also get an attack buff that can stack up to 3 times. This means that this weapon is probably best when fighting hordes of enemies, and unfortunately it can't use its passive properly when fighting solo bosses. However, nevertheless, it's still a very good option for her. When she first launched, these were definitely her absolute best in slot options. However, with the coming of Inazuma, there's now a new free-to-play option that you can use, that being the Hamayumi. What makes the Hamayumi special isn't its attack substat, but rather its passive that allows you to increase your normal and charge attack damage. And as I've previously stated and probably beaten over your head by now, her charge attacks are her main source of damage as a main DPS. So having a passive that increases them is extremely useful, especially since it can be used in all situations. On top of this, if you have her burst ready to go and on standby, then it does increase the passive by 100%, meaning that at R1 you can have up to 24% extra damage on your charge attacks, meaning that the Hamayumi is probably the best free-to-play option for players that want to cover all of their bases, regardless of whether they're fighting mobs or bosses. But at the end of the day, all three of the options that I mentioned are actually extremely viable on her, and you really can't go wrong with any of them. However, if you're planning on using Ganyu in a supporting position, then you should probably rather go with the Stringless to increase her elemental skill and burst damage, or the Favonius bow or the Sacrificial bow in order to make sure that she can have 100% uptime on her burst. Okay, but what if you do want to give her a 5-star weapon? What are her best options? Ganyu is actually one of those rare characters that can actually utilize any 5-star option that you have. However, her one and true best in slot option has actually been out since the very beginning of the game, that being the Amos bow. The Amos bow wildly increases Ganyu's overall attack due to its high base attack and attack substat. However, it's really the passive that makes this weapon so good for Ganyu. It increases her normal and charge attack by 12% and increases the damage even further for every second that it's in the air up to 5 stacks. And since Ganyu does want to be played at a decent distance, Ganyu is really one of the only characters that can properly utilize this weapon. There's also a huge perk about the Amos bow being that it is a standard banner weapon, meaning that if you're very lucky you can get it from the regular standard banner, or you can get it as an off weapon when you're going for other limited weapons, meaning that if you are completely free to play, you do have a chance of getting this weapon even if you don't go for it when it's on rate up, which in the long run could end up saving you a lot of primos. If you do manage to get your hands on the Amos bow, I would definitely recommend you using this above all other options. However, the Skyward Harp is also a decent option on her considering that it does increase both her crit rate and crit damage, and the Polar Star is also a decent option since it does increase your crit rate and also increases your elemental skill and burst damage, making it a decent hybrid between DPS and support. And speaking of support, the Elegy of the End is also a very good option for a support Ganyu, since it not only increases her elemental mastery but can provide an elemental mastery buff to her entire team and an attack buff. The only weapon that doesn't really have good synergy with Ganyu is probably the Thundering Pulse. However, even this is still a decent option on her since it is such a big stat stick. Yes, she won't be able to take advantage of the normal attack bonus, but she'll gladly take the additional 66.2% crit damage. Just keep in mind that besides the Amos bow, the 4-star weapons can actually keep up with most of the 5-star options if you have them at a high enough refinement. Okay, now what about artifacts? Ganyu currently has 2 best in slot artifact sets, and it all has to do with how you plan on playing her. If you're going for a freeze team, then you definitely want the Blizzard Strayer set, and not just the 2-piece, you definitely want to be going for the 4-piece set so that you can get up to 40% extra crit rate. This allows you to build very little crit rate on Ganyu and still be able to build a lot of crit damage on her, thus maximizing her damage so long as you can keep your enemy frozen. However, even if you aren't able to freeze your enemy completely, so long as you apply cryo to them, you'll still be getting the 20% crit rate bonus. However, if you're going for a melt comp, then instead you want to be going for the full 4-piece of the Wanderer's Troop set. Not only does it give you an additional 80 elemental mastery, but the 4-piece set also increases your charge attack damage by 35%, allowing you to absolutely nuke any enemy that is afflicted with pyro. If you don't have access to these 4-piece sets yet, then if you're going for a freeze comp, then I recommend going for a 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and 2-piece Gladiator or Shimanawa, or if you're going for a melt comp, then go for a 2-piece Blizzard Strayer, 2-piece Wanderer's Troop. This should keep you covered until you are able to manage to get a full 4-piece set. Okay, and now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about her constellations. One thing that I want to quickly get out of the way is that Ganyu works perfectly well at C0. You don't need a single constellation for her to be a viable main DPS, so if you are on a budget, you can feel free to skip all of her constellations and know that she's still going to be dealing a decent amount of damage. However, if you are a Ganyu simp and you want her to be the very best of the best, her constellations are very good. Unlike some characters, none of her constellations are bad and all of them add to her overall kit. C1 makes it so that if an enemy takes damage from a Frostflake arrow, that their cryo res is decreased by 15% for 6 seconds. Additionally, when you do hit an enemy, you also get 2 energy back for Ganyu, thus making it a little bit easier to maintain 100% uptime on her burst. While I wouldn't say that C1 is absolutely necessary, it is a nice damage boost and it does help you with your rotations. If you are a budget player, then you can definitely go for this, just keep in mind that you will be sacrificing a character in the future. Constellation 2 is also a pretty decent upgrade since it does give you an additional charge on her skill. This means if you do manage to hit the enemies both times, then you will get back 4 energy. And if both of the blossoms bloom and hit an enemy, then you'll get an additional 4 energy on top of that, meaning that you can get refunded up to 8 energy from her 2 skills. This paired with C1 makes it so that you don't really need any energy recharge on Ganyu in order to maintain a high amount of burst uptime. And it also just gives you extra damage since you're getting a second bloom. C3 is decent, all it does is really boost your burst by 3 levels. However, this in tandem with C4 is actually pretty good. C4 essentially makes it so that when an enemy is inside your burst field, they will start to take increased damage. The increased damage starts at 5% and can go all the way up to 25%, meaning that if you are hitting an enemy at the end of her burst, you're actually getting a significant damage boost. And since it's actually increasing the damage taken from enemies, this means that not only Ganyu can take advantage of this, essentially giving her whole team a big damage boost while enemies are within her burst. C5 is probably her worst constellation since it only really boosts her skill, but hey, a damage increase is a damage increase. And C6 is where Ganyu's gameplay style completely changes. This is probably what I would call a transformative constellation. Essentially, every time you use a skill, it instantly charges your Frostflake arrow, meaning that you can fire off multiple Frostflake arrows in quick succession and deal a lot, and I do mean a lot of damage all at once. Like I previously mentioned, you don't need these constellations for Ganyu to be a good unit. However, when she does reach C6, she is a much better unit. This allows you to play her as a main DPS, a quick swap support unit, essentially whatever you need Ganyu to be. And since none of her constellations are conditional by any means, it means that she's just an overall stronger unit when you reach C6. Do I recommend going for C6? Not necessarily. But if you are a whale and you want to simp over your favorite character, then Ganyu's actually a pretty safe one to do so with. Okay, and lastly, before we get into the final whether you should or should not summon for Ganyu, let's quickly go over her best teammates and team comps. One of the absolute best things about Ganyu is the fact that she has access to cryo, meaning that you can either choose to run her on a freeze comp or a melt comp depending on your gameplay preferences. If you do decide to go with a freeze comp, you can definitely go with the Morgana comp, which consists of Ganyu, Venti, Mona, and Diona. This team has been consistently in the meta for a very long time, and consistently proves to be one of the best teams for clearing Spiral Abyss. However, since the Morgana team has been formed, there are a lot of variations that you can use instead. If you don't have Venti, you can use Sucrose or Kazuha, and you can also substitute Mona for Kokumi, and Diona for Rosaria or Ayaka. Ultimately, it's just going to depend on what characters that you have available, but it is very nice that this team comp is pretty flexible. However, one note that I do want to make is that if you do have Venti and you are dealing with smaller enemies, then you should definitely be using him. This is because Ganyu's burst with Venti's burst actually has quadratic scaling, which wildly increases your total damage output. It's also really important to note that this video is going out right before Shenhe's release, and since Shenhe looks like she's going to be a dedicated cryo support, she's probably going to be one of Ganyu's absolute best support units, but we'll just have to wait and see. However, if you are currently planning on running a melt comp, then this is your best possible option. You're going to want to run Ganyu with Kazuha, Bennett, and Xiangling. Kazuha so that you can swirl both cryo and pyro in order to get both elemental damage boosters, Bennett so that you can get the absolute max amount of attack boost that you can, and finally Xiangling as your sub DPS and pyro applicator. If you do not have Kazuha, then you can run Sucrose and she does work pretty well here, but the other two units are pretty non-negotiable. You could technically run Toma instead of Xiangling, but you will be losing out on a lot of damage. But luckily Xiangling is free to play and therefore you should have her available so long as you're not using her on another team. However, these are only when you're using Ganyu as a main DPS. If you are planning on using her as a support unit, then you can easily pair her up with units such as Hu Tao, Diluc, Klee, Yoimiya, and Eula, mainly due to her off-field cryo application and energy battery. Whew, and I think with that we've covered just about everything you need to know about Ganyu. However, we still have to answer the question of whether or not she's actually worth it. In my personal opinion, I think that Ganyu is still, till this day, one of the absolute best characters in Genshin Impact. Not only is she a phenomenal main DPS, but she also has supportive capabilities. This means that even if, heaven forbid, she is power crept down the line, she still will have a lot of use since she can also support other teammates. As of recording, Ganyu still absolutely trivializes any content in the game, so long as you've properly invested into her. She's extremely free-to-play friendly considering that 3 of her best 4-star options in terms of weapons are completely free-to-play accessible, and even her best in slot 5-star option is obtainable through the standard banner, meaning that even free-to-play players have a chance of getting her absolute best in slot. Ganyu works perfectly well at C0, but she's also an absolute monster at C6, and is overall one of the most flexible units that Genshin Impact has ever created. It's kind of funny, MiHoYo actually made a character that's so well balanced that it actually made her OP. Every other character has to sacrifice some aspect of their kit in order to obtain power, but Ganyu is strong all on her own and isn't dependent on an elemental skill or burst in order to deal most of her damage, and also isn't completely reliant on her teammates in order to maintain a proper rotation. Yes, obviously her teammates do contribute to her overall damage output and can definitely take her to the next level, but even by herself, Ganyu is an absolute powerhouse. However, despite giving a lot of praise to Ganyu, I do have to harp on the fact that Ganyu is not for everyone. If you do not enjoy aim and shoot gameplay, then you definitely shouldn't be summoning for Ganyu if you want her as your main DPS. I've actually gotten a lot of comments on past videos talking about how they found Ganyu's gameplay to be boring, or that they weren't personally good at aiming and shooting, and therefore it just ended up boxing Ganyu since they couldn't properly utilize her. I think that it's so important to make sure that you playtest a unit before you decide to spend your primos on them, and Ganyu is no exception. So at the end of the day, do I think that Ganyu is worth it? 100% yes, if you do like her playstyle. I don't see her going anywhere meta-wise, and I think that she's still one of the strongest characters even 1 year after her initial release. So the only thing between you and her is whether or not you like her and your primo reserve. If you did end up enjoying this video, please feel free to check out my other videos on Xiao and Shunhe. I'll make sure to leave links to both in a pinned comment down below. Also keep in mind that I am planning on covering Zhongli in my next Worth It video. And if you did enjoy this video in particular, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. I'd greatly appreciate it, and it does help me boost into the YouTube algorithm. Let me know whether or not you're planning on summoning for Ganyu, whether you already have her, or whether you're planning on skipping her altogether in favor of other units. I'm actually pretty curious to see just how popular Ganyu still is or isn't. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content from me, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. We're actually getting very close to 20,000 subscribers, so thank you guys so much, I really do appreciate it. And if you're new and you want to help me reach that goal, then I'd greatly appreciate your support and would love to have you along for the ride. But for now, that's all that I have to say about Ganyu, so until next time, best wishes, bye!